Okay, in this video I'm going over type 1 and type 2 errors and how you can build them into social welfare functions. And the two examples I'm going to do in this video have to do with the FDA deciding what should be the burden of proof for new drugs that want to go to the market in the United States. And second, I'm going to look at the disability benefit system and, again, the burden of proof that people need to apply for or to be accepted onto the disability program in the United States. So let's look at it from those two perspectives. Okay, so here we have the situation with type 1 and type 2 errors. Basically, in both cases, we're looking at a hypothesis, a null hypothesis, and we're making some judgment about whether it's true or false, and our judgment could be good or bad. So we can have a true null, and let's start with the example of the FDA. So the FDA's hypothesis, their null hypothesis, is going to be that the drug is harmful. And that's a fairly reasonable prior to have. If you have any random new drug coming into the system, chances are it will be harmful, in which case the burden of proof is on the drug companies to show that it's not harmful. So they want to reject this null hypothesis. And the FDA, of course, is responsible for deciding whether or not the drug goes to market in the US. And there are two cases. One is the null is true. Actually, the drug is harmful, in which case this is something we don't know, it's hard to know, but the FDA has to make a decision, and if they say, actually, we accept the null, we think the drug is harmful, it's not going to go to market, and we have a good true situation, a good decision. But if we reject that hypothesis, then we have a situation where we've rejected the hypothesis that the drug is harmful, we've decided it's safe enough to go onto markets, in which case that's a type 1 hypothesis or a false negative decision about this null hypothesis. So the situation here is, one where we make a type 1 error and we approve unsafe drugs to go to market. Now, if the null hypothesis is false, meaning the drug is actually beneficial and good and not really harmful to people, then we could either accept that it's accept the null hypothesis and say, actually, we still think the drug is harmful, in which case we're making a type 2 error. That's a false positive. In this case, it's going to be approving or failing to approve an unsafe drug. Sorry, that's failing to approve a safe drug. So a drug really should be going to market, but the FDA is accepting the null hypothesis that it's harmful and not putting it on the market. And of course, if we're over here where it's a false hypothesis, the drug is truly is not harmful, this is false, but we are rejecting this hypothesis, that means we're putting the drug on the market, and this is of course a good situation. So if we're trying to think about this from a social welfare perspective, we're going to imagine the FDA is making a decision where the choice variable is going to be the burden of proof for a drug to reject this null hypothesis. So it's going to look like this. Okay, so in which case this would be a very simple social welfare function, and the reason I'm calling this a social welfare function is it is from the government perspective, where the government is trying to maximize the utility of the population. And a very simple version of this, I could have even just let this be type 1 and type 2 errors, where we're trying to minimize the type 1 and type 2 errors, and we can have some weight between them. So some, actually I won't use beta because I already used B in here, but we have some weight that I'll let be alpha. It's an importance weight we're placing on type 1 versus type 2 errors. So here we have our approve unsafe drugs. This is our type 1 error. So we're minimizing type 1 errors, the approval of unsafe drugs as a function of the burden of proof to reject this hypothesis, plus the type 2 errors, the failure to approve safe drugs as a function of the burden of proof. Now, this is a very simple social welfare function, and of course, if we wanted to expound on these, we could expound on what's the problem when we have a type 1 and type 2 error. So, let me color code this. So let's just write out what are the societal issues when we have a type 1 error, or approval of unsafe drugs. So of course the biggest problem with the type 1 error is that there's harm done to the people who are put on that drug. And if we're thinking about the magnitude of that harm, we might want to think about what are the number of people who would be on the drug, and what's the duration of their harm before we figure out that this drug causes harm. So you might imagine if we have a system after putting drugs on the market of continual oversight of the drug and continual collection of data about how the drug affects people, we might be able to reduce the duration of that harm, in which case that would reduce the magnitude of the impact of type 1 errors on the population. So we could rewrite this social welfare function with this instead of the classic type 1 error. Now let's think about the type 2 error and what kind of harm that causes. Now, of course, the type 2 errors can cause harm to patients who could have received the drug but are not being allowed to have the drug. And if you have a lot of type 2 errors, a lot of failing to approve drugs that are truly safe and truly effective, that could reduce innovation, because innovators are going to have to come up with more and more drugs just to get one drug through the FDA approval process. So this is just an overview of how type 1 and type 2 errors can be used in a social welfare function, and there's lots of situations where this might apply. Now, the federal disability, I'm actually going to let you think about how type 1 and type 2 errors come up when thinking about the federal disability program. Basically, the government has to decide when someone applies to have disability, meaning they get a check every month and access to Medicare for the rest of their lives, the government decides, yes, do we put them on disability, or no, do we not allow them to be on disability? And you can think about the type 1 and type 2 errors involved.